Hello and welcome to another special USA edition of Spectator TV. We're delighted so many of you, over 200,000 at the last count, tuned into our previous two episodes. And a special thanks to those of you who gave us feedback and comments. Some were even helpful. Please continue to do so and email at spectatortv@spectator.co.uk. Spectator TV viewers can also get 10% off a subscription to our US publication if they go to spectator.us/subscribe and enter the promo code TV. We'll also throw in a free whiskey tumbler, but sadly not the whiskey. You know what American liquor laws are like. Last night's first presidential square-off wasn't so much a debate as a squabble, and an unseemly one at that. It's not entirely clear who won, perhaps Joe Biden because he didn't fall on his face or disappear into a word salad. Yes, the bar wasn't high for Mr. Biden, but there is no doubt who lost: America and its reputation for robust and intelligent democratic debate. The language of the playground predominated, so let me resort to it by saying Donald J. Trump started it. He heckled and hectored his opponent from the start, and moderator Chris Wallace struggled to control it. It was the worst presidential debate I've ever seen, and I've seen them all, way back to Nixon Kennedy, though not Lincoln Douglas. But then they weren't presidential debates. You knew that, didn't you? Anyway, here are the lowlights.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
Who's on your list?
Right, gentlemen, I think
This
we've
is
ended
so
this.
He's going to pack the court.
We have
I'm not going to give a list.
Did you use the word smart? So you said you went to Delaware State, but you forgot the name of your college. You didn't go to Delaware State. You graduated either the lowest or almost the lowest in your class. Don't ever use the word smart with me.
He was a patriot, and the people left behind there were heroes.
Really?
And I resent.
Are you talking
like
about Hunter?
hell.
Are you talking about
I'm
Hunter?
talking about my son, Beau Biden. You're talking about
I don't know Beau. I know Hunter.
Yeah,
Hunter
you know
got
Beau.
thrown. Hunter got thrown out of the military. But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that. And I'll tell you what.
What does that mean,
From a
not go
common
along?
sense,
Does that mean you're
I'll tell
gonna
you
tell
what
your
it means.
people to take to the
It means you
street?
have a fraudulent election. With you,
Go
they
ahead.
say,
You get
"Here's the
wait
deal."
a minute. You get the final word, Mr.
Well, it's hard to get any word in with this clown. Excuse me. This.
Hey,
this
let me just
person.
say to you.
The first presidential debate. Now, to discuss all of that, I'm delighted to be joined by the political strategist, Luke Thompson, pollster Marcus Roberts, head of international projects at YouGov, as well as the Spectator's very own Amber Athey and Freddie Gray. Look, first of all, you're the American here. How bad was it?
It wasn't an edifying spectacle. I don't know that any televised debate in recent ages has been all that particularly useful for the voters trying to make up their minds. Most of these things are sort of boring reality shows. But last night, while not boring, definitely had all of the sort of substance of your run-of-the-mill reality show. Politically speaking, the person who needed to change the dynamics of the race was the president. I don't think that the president succeeded in doing that. In many ways, I think his team got what they wanted. They got a flustered Joe Biden who 5 days of full-time debate prep had not made ready to answer anything beyond the easiest questions. Biden was easily rattled. At times he seemed lost. And yet his best friend on the stage last night was not the moderator, and it wasn't his own team's preparation, but the president, who kept bailing him out when he would get stuck trying to dance away from a question like court packing that he didn't want to answer. So insofar as Trump came in with a strategy of throwing Biden off of out of his comfort zone and making him look silly, that worked. And then they failed to close the deal because they went too far with the filibustering.
The thing is, Amber, the Trump campaign, Mr. Trump himself, they've made much of Mr. Biden's cognitive decline. And we've seen some evidence of that on the campaign trail, some quite embarrassing moments. He had a few dodgy moments last night, but there was no disaster for him, was there?
No, it wasn't. And the campaign should have known better than to really hit that line of attack really hard, because as we saw in the Democratic primary debates, Joe Biden performed particularly well. He didn't really have these types of gaffes that we would see when he's out on the campaign trail or if he's talking to voters. And the campaign realized that far too late. And it was in fact last week when they had their surrogates going out on television and talking about how much of a seasoned and experienced and talented debater Joe Biden is, pointing to the fact that, of course, he won the 2008 and 2012 vice presidential debates. But if you've spent an entire year telling people that this candidate has dementia and is in cognitive decline, and then turn around a week before the debate and talk about how they expect him to win against their own candidate, it just comes across as really too little too late.
Freddie, Trump has a real gender problem. He's ahead with male voters. He's way behind with almost every category of female voters. And I just wonder if that kind of bluster, the heckling, the hectoring, the almost sort of trying to bully Joe Biden. I mean, if you want female votes, I would suggest that may not be the best way to go about it.
Well, I agree. And I mean, I think we hear a lot about suburban mums, suburban women being the key demographic in this race. And if you look at a moment like the Hunter-Beau moment in the debate last night, where Biden was talking about his dead son, and Trump simply said, "I don't know, Beau, I want to talk about Hunter," who is the son with lots of allegations of corruption surrounding him. I mean, that seems to me, I'm not a very sensitive person, extremely callous. I would have thought a lot of women, a lot of mothers would have found that shocking.
Look, Mr. Biden was interesting in the way several times he distanced himself from the left of the Democrats. He said, I'm the Democratic Party for now. He called his own plan a Green New Deal, but he said, no, it's not the AOC Bernie Sanders Green New Deal, which is much more extreme. Is that a sign of confidence that he feels he can distance himself from that part of the Democratic Party that was calling the shots during the primaries?
Well, I think that the Biden team would push back on the notion that that part of the party was calling the shots during the primaries. Whether they would be right to do that or not is a separate question. The most telling moment in the debate was, and where I think you saw Biden get the most uncomfortable, was when Trump began to push him on what would happen to public health insurance. A more able and detail-oriented debater could have pinned Biden on the fact that his running mate, Kamala Harris, has said 8 different things about healthcare, but including getting rid of private health insurance. That made Biden very, very uncomfortable. And that's when he sort of had his l'état c'est moi moment where he said, I'm the Democratic Party. Joe Biden is not the Democratic Party. Joe Biden was not the first preference of most Democratic primary voters. He won because of a combination of some fairly arcane primary rules, some good luck, and having deep reservoirs of support with older Black voters in the South. I don't think that he comes to this from a position of confidence. I also don't think his campaign is thinking one day past election day right now. If you can say anything for them, they're not measuring the drapes in the Oval Office. They are focused on keeping him in a position where he can win, given the lead that he has right now. In terms of Joe Biden's relationship with the left, he tried to have it both ways last night. And Trump helped him. Again, Trump's insistence on bluster bailed him out of a number of different situations that I think another more able, more focused candidate could have exploited. Biden referred to his plan as the Green New Deal, then said he wasn't in favor of the Green New Deal. Biden said he won the Democratic primary by opposing getting rid of private health insurance, but then turned around and endorsed a public option. Then he said the public option would only apply to people already on Medicaid. He was a mess last night, and Trump was just so much messier that none of that managed to be, highlighted or amplified.
I want to bring Marcus in just a minute and come on to the issues, but Amber, let me ask you this. Will there be any stage in this campaign where Mr. Biden will sit down with a well-informed interviewer and raise these very points that Luke has been talking about and pin him down on these points?
No, it's very unlikely, and it's quite funny to watch how Chris Wallace moderated the debate last night and actually assisted him in several key points. But when you look back at just a few weeks earlier, Chris Wallace was constantly talking about how he was inviting Biden to sit down for an interview with him like he did with the president, and how Biden continuously refused. as we go through the next two debates, the moderators are going to be even more left-leaning than Chris Wallace supposedly is. And so Biden has essentially gotten through the toughest type of questioning that he will ever get from a reporter. And yet still, he wasn't pinned down on court packing. He wasn't pinned down on healthcare, as Luke said. And it would be silly for him to go out of his way to sit down with a tough reporter because he has nothing to gain really by doing so.
He can only get through it if Trump keeps bailing him out, which if Trump is there, will happen, I think.
But it seems that a lot of lessons from Boris Johnson have been learned during election campaigns about getting interviews. Marcus, YouGov did a snap poll after the debate last night. What were the findings?
A clear Biden win. 48 points to Joe Biden, 41 points to the president. And within that, everything you would expect about how voters felt the tone and temperament of the debate was. 83% of voters feeling that the tone was negative. 69% of voters saying that they left the debate feeling annoyed. So what we saw and what we felt was very much what the American people were seeing and feeling. A Biden win thanks to the president's poor and unpresidential behavior. And that, I think, is really important to bear in mind in terms of how it plays out with those crucial suburban female voters. Nicole Wallace, the Republican strategist, said on MSNBC last night that in 3 presidential campaigns of advising Republicans on how to win over larger numbers of suburban women who are so critical to any Republican or Democratic presidential campaign success, the one thing you don't want to do is turn up and be unpresidential, be rude, be arrogant, be bullying. And those were all of the things that the president demonstrated last night. And that's going to be a problem for him picking up those vital voters.
Let me look at the issues that came up in the debate. There was some discussion of the issues in between the shouting and the heckling. COVID, Mr. Trump's handling of it, the economy, healthcare, law and order. COVID and healthcare, I would suggest, playing to Mr. Biden's positions, the economy and law and order, perhaps to Mr. Trump's. Was there any cut through on policy though, Luke, or was it just repeating what we already know?
Well, I think in the case of Trump prosecuting a case against Biden, both for indecision and for taking positions well out of the mainstream of American politics, there were lots of opportunities that, Biden led with his jaw on a number of fronts, everywhere from environmental regulation, even in areas where he's strong like healthcare. But Trump failed to deliver the blow. The first 5 to 10 minutes of the debate, if you told me pick which candidate spent 5 days doing full-time debate prep, I would have said Trump. Trump came out of the gate. He was aggressive and he was a bit rude, but not outside of the mainstream of Donald Trump. But he focused on substantive issues. And for the first 5 to 10 minutes of the debate, it looked like he was going to mop the floor with Joe Biden. I think at that point, we exhausted both the restraint that Trump has and also perhaps his preparation for details. I think the biggest areas where people were looking for policy breakthrough are not around COVID or the economy, actually. The polling there has been pretty stable. They've been split. Vice President Biden gets better ratings on how he would have handled COVID. Trump gets better ratings on the economy generally. But I do think on healthcare and environmental regulation, even more than law and order, those were big areas where there were meaningful distinctions between the two campaigns that are going to have ramifications for voters. And in both cases, I felt like Biden was incoherent and Trump was too self-involved in his response to exploit that incoherence and point out to voters both that Biden doesn't know where he stands and that when he does know, it's probably well outside what they want.
But we'll hear more about the polls from Marcus in a minute. But Mr. Biden is ahead in the national poll, for what that's worth. He's still ahead in the battleground average polls as well. Mr. Trump had to do better than he did last night, did he not? The Trump campaign must be disappointed, if they're honest.
He did. Trump is leading from behind right now. And for him to really move the polls last night had to be a stellar debate, and it really wasn't. And I think even people who are diehard supporters of the president, I watched the debate last night with about 40 other conservatives. felt disappointed walking away from that. They felt like the president could have and should have done much better. Now, the one good thing in the president's favor is that he tends to improve as these debates go on. We saw that in 2016. Each debate with Hillary, he was more measured, better prepared, and able to land those blows rather than just pick away and be petty. So if he's able to keep up that trend as these debates go on, provided they don't get canceled because of how horrific the first one is, then I do think Trump has a chance to make up some ground. Of course, the problem here is that so many people are early voting because of the coronavirus. And so the question is how many people's minds are really willing and able to be changed before Election Day at this point, and that the polls suggest very few.
I was struck, Freddie, but I mean, we know that sometimes politicians and honesty are two things that pass in the night. But I was struck by both candidates, particularly Mr. Trump, and Mr. Biden did it as well, by just the massive whoppers they tell. You know, Mr. Trump saying this is, until COVID, it was the greatest economy ever, with the greatest job creation and all the rest of it. And Mr. Biden saying, we gave you a really fast growing economy and you trashed it into recession and all the rest of it. I mean, do they know that they're just talking nonsense when they say these things?
Well, I think, I mean, I don't think it really occurs to either of them. I think what you're dealing with, I think what you're dealing with is two different realities in America. And so in a way, it's not really the candidate's fault, although I think they did very badly last night. I think they're both speaking to what they think are their bases. And that both their bases, as I say, watch entirely different media and exist in two different realities. And sort of the truth and sort of anything reasonable falls somewhere in between the two.
Marcus, what do you think the takeaways will be? We've got the vice presidential debate next week. That will be interesting, but it rarely moves the dial on anything. And then we've got two more presidential debates, one on October the 15th and the final one on October the 22nd. I assume they're still going to take place. I see some Biden people saying you shouldn't bother turning up. It was all a disgrace. But assuming they do take place, would I not be right in thinking that, I mean, if I was Joe Biden, I'd have been very nervous last night in the run-up to it. I'd approach the 15th of October now with a bit more confidence, would I not? Marcus.
I think that's very fair, not least of all because, as Amber was saying earlier, every day that passes in which the president doesn't make up ground is a day to the increasing advantage of Joe Biden and the Biden campaign. That's because of the sheer number of votes that are being cast right now in terms of early voting. That will only pick up and escalate exponentially as we head towards mid-October. And that means that by the time October 15th runs around, if we say that there's about this many undecided voters left right now, there'll be about this many left by then. What is happening in simple terms is that President Trump needs to win almost all of the undecided voters that are left and also reach into what is currently Biden's electoral coalition, which contains a measure of Trump 2016 voters. President Trump needs to win those people back. Time is running out for winning them back. He didn't do it last night, and now he's going to wait 2 weeks until he gets another shot at trying to do so again.
I'll come back to you for more details in the post in a minute. Just let me go down, first of all, here to look. Mr. Trump did not get the breakthrough he needed last night, or certainly wanted. What should he do come the second debate to do better, in your view? And can he?
Well, you know, what's the first thing they say? You know, you have to want to change, and I think that there's a question about whether or not Trump will want to pivot into what his advisors say is a better posture for winning these things. Here's how I would frame it to the president to sort of drive this home. 4 years ago, he won in large part on a single line by pointing to Hillary Clinton and saying, she says I'm with her, I say I'm with you. He made the debate about not just the voters, but who actually cared about the voters. The Biden campaign is clearly sensitive to that concern. They're clearly sensitive to the charge, which Trump made last night, that he will have done more in 48 months than Biden has done in 48 years in politics. Those are genuine weaknesses. And so Biden repeated frequently, it's not about my family, it's not about your family, it's about the American family, etc. He kept trying to push it back on the voters. The worst moment for Trump was at the end when Wallace asked about election integrity and election security, and Trump more or less went on a 20-minute tirade about himself, about the system being rigged, about the fake news, and about voter fraud, instead of talking about what he would deliver in 4 additional years for the voters. At the end of the day, American voters vote for president, not just based on who they think they want to get a beer with, although that's a factor, not based on people's experience, although that's a factor, not based just on partisanship, although that's probably the biggest factor, or how foreign policy and the economy are performing, but whether or not they view you as a credible messenger or a credible vehicle for advancing their best interests over the next 4 years. Trump has to talk about that. He has to talk about voters. He has to make this about the voters, their expectations, and who can deliver for them. If he goes down more rabbit holes about fighting with the moderator or arguing about voter fraud, then he's going to miss the forest for the trees.
Okay, polls. That's what we talk about, even though in 2016 we learned that they, how shall I put it, are not always accurate or exactly on the button, especially in the battleground states. Marcus, you've been going through the latest numbers. You've got some slides for us. Talk us through what the polling currently tells us.
Okay, well, let's start with the YouGov MRP. This is the multi-level regression with post-stratification model. It rolls off the tongue. It's a big poll encompassing lots of different sources of data. In this case, there's 69,000 respondents that went into this model. It's showing a clear lead for Vice President Biden, projecting that if the election were held today, he'd be winning 53 to 44.9 in the popular vote. And look at that Electoral College landslide, 350 to 188. And that's because of the way that voters are breaking currently. Simply put, it is currently more likely that Vice President Biden wins extraordinarily Republican states like Georgia and Texas than it is that President Trump manages to put together a coalition to get back to 270. And that's why Vice President Biden is in the driving seat in terms of the Electoral College and the popular vote right now. And if we move on and we see what is driving this, you'll see that the composition of that electorate that is allowing Biden to secure that lead is the recreation of the Obama coalition of 2008 and 2012, rather than the Clinton coalition that was insufficient to the job in 2016. Look at those very high numbers of support, obviously, amongst African-American voters and 2016 Hillary voters. But what's interesting is that sliver, that important sliver, those 5 points of Donald Trump 2016 voters that tend to be more white, blue-collar voters in the critical battleground states that Vice President Biden has won back to his cause. What Vice President Biden has to do beyond this is ensure that that Hispanic number, which is historically still a little south of where the Democrats need it to be, continues to go up. If that goes up towards 70%, you'd expect Vice President Biden to win Florida and for election night to be very short. If that number stays down at 63%, there's a good chance that the Republicans will take Florida, and we could be settling in for a few weeks of discussion, to put it politely and mildly, over who's going to be the next president. If we move on and see what the favorability comparisons are, this is important because Freddie and I, over a number of podcasts, for several months have been discussing how important it is not just to look at President Trump's voting intention number, but also his favorability rating. And basically our rule of thumb has been whatever number is higher, whether it's the favorability number or the voting intention number, presume that's the number of people who are going to vote for the president. And right now, both of those numbers are in the low 40s for Donald Trump, and that's not where they need to be for him to win the election. In comparison, if we look at the next slide, we see Joe Biden's favorability number is also pretty close to what his voting intention number is, slightly south of that in comparison with the MRP I showed earlier, but that still shows the difference. Voters preferring in favorability terms the vice president to the president. Now let's look at the next slide in terms of the one great area of strength for President Trump, which is on the economy. And that is that despite everything with regard to unemployment, despite everything with regard to growth, despite everything with regard to the economic catastrophe of the coronavirus pandemic, the president still has an advantage as most trusted leader on the economy. And Democrats will be seeking to chip away at that advantage, probably by making more of the attack on taxes. And finally, let's turn to where the debate ended up, which is this discussion of whether or not the election itself will be fair and whether or not the election will be resolved peacefully. And this is really concerning, because out of likely voters, 27% of likely voters are saying that they only have a little bit of confidence or none at all that the election outcome will be fair. And that is a recipe for serious concern about the democratic process. And let's conclude, therefore, by looking at this question of transition. About half of Americans do not think there will be a peaceful transition of power if the outcome of the election is contested. And that takes me back to my previous point about Florida, which is the importance of Florida being called on the night, one way or another, in order to ensure a short process rather than a long one. Now, there's one reason to hope that actually the Florida process may be shorter than expected, which is Florida does allow for the counting of early votes in advance of the close of polls, which means it won't be the case that we're having to wait on hundreds of thousands or even millions of ballots to be counted after polls close in Florida. But if we end up with a close race and a tight race in Florida, and God forbid a 2000 style recount, then I think we'd be settling in for quite a long contested contest.
Marcus, I understand thank you for that, explaining that. The pollsters have made some methodological changes compared to 2016. I understand one of the changes is they're allowing in their samples, they're allowing much more for education. That because education had not been a huge determinant historically of how people voted, it wasn't taken much into account in 2016, but in 2016 it was a huge determinant. The less college degree you had, the less education, the much more likely you were to vote for Mr. Trump. Has the polling now been adapted to take that into account?
That is probably the biggest single change in pollster methodology over the last 4 years. And that's the change that allowed pollsters to go from getting the 2016 election wrong at the battleground state level to getting the 2018 midterms right at the battleground state level. What it means is looking at whether or not voters have a college degree or not. And by ensuring that that's a filter in the way in which polls are constructed, you get a more accurate sample. So that, along with the simple advantage that this cycle enjoys over 4 years ago, we just have more high quality pollsters polling the battleground states more often, which means that we don't have to wait for so long, or our averages are skewed by a smaller pool of often less high quality pollster results, means that we should look, I think, with more confidence to the accuracy of the polls in this cycle than that of 4 years ago.
I was looking at the recent poll in Pennsylvania, the state. Mr. Trump probably has to win if he's to stay in the White House. He won it last time. And of course, he wins it from the western counties, which are more rural, more blue collar, and so on. The Democrats rack up huge votes in Philadelphia. I always thought it was rather funny that Hillary Clinton should choose to have her final rally in Philadelphia, a city she was already going to win, because the other parts of Pennsylvania she was going to lose, which she did. But the polling this time showed Mr. Biden naturally doing very well in Philadelphia, but doing very well in the suburbs among women too, doing twice as well as Hillary Clinton did with women. And I don't know how this, but holding his own in the western counties. And that combination gives, on that polling, gives Mr. Biden Pennsylvania. Is that a broadly correct interpretation?
That's very much the case, because I think if you were to think of the difference between the Biden campaign and the Hillary campaign as this, the Biden campaign believes that politics is about addition rather than subtraction. The Hillary campaign practiced a politics that said only the purest of the pure are going to be part of our electoral coalition, and almost went out of its way at times, it seemed, to insult any number of the voters that it actually needed to win. The Biden campaign, in contrast, and you saw this very much through Vice President Biden's addresses direct to voters through the camera last night, is determined to win back the trust and demonstrate respect towards those voters that it doesn't have and that it needs. And that political tonal difference helps explain enormously what's happening in Western Pennsylvania.
Okay, look, you're shaking your head there. What's your take?
Yeah, I don't know that I buy that at all. I don't see much of a tonal difference between the Biden campaign and the Clinton campaign. What I see is that Clinton made certain gaffes, like saying we're going to put a bunch of coal miners out of work in Ohio, or referring to primarily white working class voters as deplorables. And Joe Biden has been on both sides of major issues. I mean, this is a matter of obvious public record. He said he's going to ban fracking. Now he says he's not going to ban fracking. That's an issue that is very big in Pennsylvania, where the energy economy depends on hydraulic fracturing. But Joe Biden has not been forced to account for these sorts of things. Ultimately, focusing on Pennsylvania, you will have the same strategy that Clinton pursued by Biden. Mobilize voters in Pittsburgh in the West and Philadelphia in the East. Persuade suburban women in Bucks County and the other Philadelphia collar counties who are primarily middle and upper middle class white suburban dwellers, and then try to minimize the amount of damage that takes place in the rural and exurban counties over the rest of the state. Joe Biden is doing the exact same thing. The difference is simply going to be whether or not Biden can in fact turn out tens of thousands more black voters who stayed home in 2016. I think there's a decent argument that he will be able to, and whether or not he will be able to persuade suburban voters in the collar counties. I think there's a reasonable argument that he will be able to do that as well. So the strategies don't differ at all. The messages actually don't reasonably differ, in part because both candidates, Clinton and Biden, have taken both sides of multiple issues, but the treatment by the press that Biden has enjoyed is far better than the treatment by the press that Clinton enjoyed. And frankly, he's running against an incumbent president with a terrible economy, whereas Clinton and Trump were both running for an open seat, and those are fundamentally different political dynamics. But no, I think that the Biden campaign will tell you that they're trying to practice a politics of inclusion versus Clinton practicing a politics of exclusion. But I don't think that's either a fair characterization or of the Clinton effort, nor does it accurately reflect the overall continuity in Democratic strategy, especially in Pennsylvania, between the two campaigns.
Quick reply, Marcus?
Listening to Luke, I have a lot of sympathy because it reminds me of listening to Democratic Party or Labour Party in the UK critiques of Boris Johnson or of Donald Trump 4 years ago. I think a lot of the points are very right about saying, how can you say this when you used to say that? When we examine the policy differences, don't we understand that there's a bigger cleavage, a bigger difference? But actually what mattered in those elections and what was the way in which voters viewed those figures. And Joe Biden is a much more sympathetic figure to white working class Americans than Hillary Clinton was. And that allows him to do a politics that isn't just based on the different policy positions he may have taken, a more powerful personal politics that allows that appeal to hit home.
Okay.
I dispute the notion that there's a powerful personal politics to Biden that isn't a negation of Donald Trump. I don't think that the entire Scranton Joe shtick works. I don't think it works at all because he's been running that shtick when he's running for president of the last 40 years. And the only time it's ever worked was when he was seen as the safest, highest probability chance to beat a thermonuclear unpopular Republican incumbent in a Democratic primary electorate. So I don't think that there are any intrinsic personal values about Biden or his personality that are propelling his candidacy. I think it's all a politics of, you hate Trump, I am the safest vehicle to counter Trump, pick me. And I think it's going to get him into the White House.
Let me bring in Freddie and Amber and put a proposition to you. I'm beginning to think that the Trump campaign is in some trouble now. The polls are not really moving the way he would want them. Last night's performance, everybody seems to agree, was not right. And he seems to be positioning himself to lose big time in the popular vote, but then make a big deal out of the mail-in votes. The votes counted on the day may well give him a sense of victory, the votes counted in the days afterwards, could well put Mr. Biden ahead. And he's preparing that ground because he's going to say, hey, I won on the day. These votes that have come in all over the place and been counted here, there, and everywhere, they're fraudulent. It's a fiddle. You can't count them. It's the only ones that voted on the day matter. He's almost preparing the ground for defeat, I would suggest, Freddie, and then to have a fight to still try and win.
I think that's exactly what he's doing. And he possibly did it a little bit in 2016 and was perhaps surprised when he won. But I think what Luke and Marcus were talking about was they actually agree in a way, in that Biden is the weak point of Biden's campaign is that he's a phony, really. And the trouble for the Trump campaign is they found him slippery to deal with because they want to call him sort of senile, sleepy Joe, etc. But actually sort of phony Joe or sort of accusing him of lying, which was obviously what they said about Hillary Clinton all the time, is a much more effective way of pinning him down on his hypocrisies.
But are there not signs that the Trump campaign really does think he's going to lose, but it has a plan, a dangerous plan, a plan that could well cause a constitutional crisis, to grasp victory from the jaws of defeat?
Well, it certainly feels that way with all of the interviews he's given in terms of people asking him if he will accept the results of the election. And he keeps saying, well, we'll have to wait and see. And that's precisely because of what you mentioned, which is that he is going to set the ground for the mail-in ballot fraud. And he did that again last night, of course, when asked about election integrity by Chris Wallace. And, you know, I do want to hit on Freddie's point about Joe Biden being a phony, because I wrote an article for the Spectator US just yesterday, giving the Trump campaign advice for how to attack this cult of personality, or lack thereof, surrounding Joe Biden as this blue-collar champion, because his career has really shown the opposite. He's supported trade policies like NAFTA and TPP and normalizing relations in China that sent manufacturing jobs abroad and hurt the working class in places like Detroit and Pittsburgh. And he also has lied repeatedly about his blue-collar roots. Of course, his presidential campaign back in '88 was derailed by the fact that he had plagiarized a speech from a British politician where he claimed that he was the first in his family to go to college, and that his grandparents and parents were coal miners. And neither of those things turned out to be accurate for Joe Biden. So he plagiarized and lied. If the Trump campaign is able to point out that, yeah, Trump is a billionaire, he's never grown up in the suburbs, his parents didn't work on selling oil heaters, but he maybe understands the policies that affect the working class far better than Biden, despite the fact that Biden has spent his entire career in politics talking about that. That's a much better message than whatever happened on stage last night.
Marcus, I'll finish up this segment with you. I don't know whether you've detected it. For those of us who like America, want America to do well, there's a growing concern that it could be heading for a major constitutional crisis. That the result will not be clear on the night, though Mr. Trump may well claim victory. The results are going to come dribbling in for days afterwards, which could change the overall balance of the vote. We move into an interregnum of 11 weeks between voting and the date of the inauguration, 20th of January. That bit is in the Constitution. And America could be going through a huge battle over who has actually won the election. And there'll be arguments about, in some states, could even send 2 sets of delegates to the Electoral College. That's happened before. It happened in 1876. Who knows what happens when our biggest ally, the United Kingdom's biggest ally, is consumed with a constitutional crisis. There was one that came close in 1932. The handover between Hoover and FDR was very messy. Hoover was not at all helpful. He tried to stop things. It was an unpleasant handover. During that time when America seemed to be frozen, it came very close to social disruption. And Hitler came to power in Germany, and the Japanese invaded China. What will President Xi or President Putin do in this 11-week interregnum? I think the more I speak to people, the more concerned, that regardless of whether they're Trump or Biden, they are seriously concerned about the chaos that could follow on November the 3rd. What do you think, Marcus?
I'm someone who grew up in America. I worked there for 15 years before coming back to the UK. I find it very painful watching the debate last night and listening particularly at the end to the possibility of a contested election and the comments around the potential of violence. And I think you're right, Andrew, that there's a very real foreign policy risk in all of this as well. Because when the world lacks strong and stable American leadership, the bad guys can get out of line. And that's why the election needs to have a clear and quick result. That's why there needs to be a strong and determined transition. One can only hope that if there is a change of administration, that the Trump administration will take a lesson out of the very successful Bush to Obama transition model and what Chief of Staff Josh Bolton did there at the end of that administration in order to ensure that America's role on the world stage can continue in a strong and positive way. But for those of us who have a deep and abiding love for America, it's very frightening to see these democratic norms unraveling and the prospect of actual violence in the wake of an American presidential election.
Freddie, what do you make of it? I mean, we all think, in the United Kingdom, we think we've got an unwritten constitution, and so the passage of power, the passing of power from one to another can be a bit messy, but actually it's rarely messy. It usually happens pretty seamlessly. But we think America with a written constitution, well, the rules are laid down, it's got to happen this way and so on. But when you look at the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act, I mean, they're full of holes and ways of interpreting and all the rest of it. And there's that marvelous quote from the academic who wrote the book on, or recent book on what might happen after November the 3rd. The Constitution does not guarantee a peaceful transfer of power. It presupposes a peaceful transfer of power. That's quite worrying.
Well, I mean, it depends on a certain amount of civility and goodwill on both sides.
Oh, well, we'll be all right then, because that's obviously...
We're swimming in
civility these days. That's what makes me even more worried.
Well, what I worry about actually is, I mean, you know, you hear a lot, you talk to people in Britain about it, they say, oh, Trump's a rogue, he won't accept the election result. I'm not sure a lot of people outside of America realize just quite how hypocritical the Democrats are being about this. I mean, the sort of sanctimony with which they talk about protecting democracy and upholding it, all the while admitting that they're not going to accept the result. I mean, Hillary Clinton has told Joe Biden to not accept the result under any circumstances on election night. Right. I think what a lot of people outside America don't realize is the extent to which both sides are cheating, and I would say, or planning not to accept the result. And I would say the Democrats are being more devious about it than even Trump.
But let me ask you this, because how did America get itself into a situation where if it's going to have mail-in votes, or as we would call them postal votes, that they're not counted on the day, that they have to be in by the day, as they do in Britain, and are then counted on the day together. Indeed, in some cases, they're counted in advance. So they then add the votes on the day onto the postal votes, and that night we get the result. Has America got itself into a position where it could be days, maybe even weeks, and you'll still be, to use an expletive, you'll still be counting the bloody votes? I mean, it's absurd.
Right, and I think one of the biggest contributors to this is the fact that each state gets to set its own rules for how these mail-in ballots work. So if there were some type of universal system, I mean, obviously the argument can be made that universal bureaucratic systems are not very efficient either, but at the very least, we'd all be operating under the same set of rules. Instead, every state has different ideas of when they can start counting ballots, whether or not a ballot counts based on how it's filled out. And really, we're setting ourselves up for this really nasty fight between all of these different localities. And it's really concerning. You know, I actually am moving in a couple of weeks, and I've been dealing with the Virginia Board of Elections, and I've been less than pleased with how they're handling that. I mean, all I really had to do supposedly was send in a change of address form. And yet when I checked the online database just yesterday to see the status of my address change, it turned out that I was no longer in the system at all. So now I'm going to have to spend probably several hours on the phone with the Board of Elections trying to make sure that I can vote come November 4th. So I can only imagine what that is like when you scale it up to all of these other people who are trying to be sure that their votes are going to count on Election Day, and then look at all of the different rules from all the different states across the country. It is going to be an absolute mess, to be sure.
Andrew, can I jump in to give people some peace of mind on this? Because I think there's a lot of anxiety that may not be well anchored. Two of the best states at counting votes in America are Ohio and Florida, and we're going to probably get good results from them early on election night, if not, shortly after midnight, the day after Election Day. There are essentially three factors when it comes to counting absentee ballots. One is opening the envelope. The other is doing a signature check to make sure that the affidavit signature matches the signature on record for the person who is casting the ballot. And then the third is tabulating the vote. Tabulating the votes is all done by machines, and that takes almost no time at all. So Ohio and Florida do not tabulate the votes until Election Day, but that's just a matter of running them through machines, either at precincts, or some of them do it at centralized county level facilities where you have observers from both parties. The challenge is taking the vote out of the ballot, out of the envelope, and doing the affidavit signature check. And that takes a lot of time. And in places where people who are either disproportionately elderly populations or where they haven't voted by mail before, you can get a lot of problems that jump up here because they don't sign the affidavit line, or they have a signature that's at variance with the signature that's on record. They don't have a signature on record, etc. And as in, say, New York City during the Democratic primary this summer, where 20% of ballots were thrown out, I think in Queens or one of the boroughs, that was largely a byproduct of signature failures and incomplete absentee ballot filling out by voters who hadn't done it before. So in critical swing states, I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of problems. I think we'll be fine in Ohio, and I think we'll be fine in Florida. You will have large and protracted vote counting situations in California and in New York and elsewhere, where the rules are a kind of toxic combination of allowing votes to come in late and preventing the elections officials from even beginning the process of opening, matching, and tabulating until after Election Day. But that's really not going to be a question on Election Day. So I think a lot of this is people working themselves into a frenzy. To my mind, the odds of a violent transition of power are extremely low. And the one instance that we didn't talk about yet on this discussion is 2000, where we went for over a month without a settled winner. Things had to go up to the Supreme Court, where Al Gore's argument that he should only have to recount heavily Democratic counties in Florida was shot down by the Supreme Court, and George W. Bush was made the next president. We will be fine. We will be fine. Everybody just needs to relax. Everybody needs to vote, and it will be fine.
All right. Look, you've helped to reassure me. I'm not totally convinced, because I can see that these signatures will become the hanging chads of 2020, because that's where all the legal challenges will be. But of course, it won't matter so much if it's California or New York, because nothing will change the outcome of these states. And it is the battleground states we should look at. But it's,
and Joe Biden has got 600 teams of lawyers across the country already to challenge the signatures.
There's already 300 lawsuits.
That's normal. This though, guys, this is normal. Like
it's
litigating presidential
lawyers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lawyers are unfortunately part of the process now, alas.
Indeed they are. Unfortunate indeed, but it is America. We got to know a bit about Donald Trump's income tax returns this week, thanks to the New York Times. And surprise, surprise, he pays hardly any income tax at all, according to the New York Times story. I guess so many of his companies make losses. He's up to his neck in debt as well, which of course you can write off before you pay tax. And that meant that I think in 1 year he paid $750. But perhaps no surprise in the end that he doesn't pay much tax. It may not upset his base, because nothing seems to upset them, but it must cause some people to ponder.
I really don't think so. You know, Trump not releasing his tax returns was supposed to be this huge issue in the 2016 election. People didn't really care about it. And now people, when they are seeing his tax returns, they're actually getting the sense that he might be a better businessman than they realize. Sure, he has all of these losses and debts, but he's also managed to somehow be a billionaire who only paid $750 in 1 year. I think that's admirable to a lot of normal Americans who are always trying to get over on their taxes. So it might be somewhat frustrating for some people, but I think they also are more envious than they are angry at him.
Well, he's a billionaire. He's a debt billionaire. That's different from being a billionaire like Bill Gates or Mr. Bezos. But do Americans really think, I mean, isn't the American view is that entrepreneurs, business people, they invest, they create lots of jobs, they create new businesses, often world-beating, and they pay taxes that pay for infrastructure and welfare and so on. I mean, Mr. Trump hasn't done any of that.
Sure, but this was an argument in 2016 as well. I think that this issue has just already been litigated and already been decided by the American people. Hillary Clinton made the point over and over again that Trump was not as wealthy as he claimed to be, that he was a fraud, that he wasn't contributing to the system. And that ended up not really being a deciding factor for voters on election day. So while this is relatively new information in terms of seeing the actual tax returns, the attacks that come from it are not new.
Look, that would make, if Amber's right, it would make America the only democracy in the world that doesn't care if a billionaire, or claimed billionaire, self-certified billionaire, pays less tax than a primary school teacher.
Well, without going into the arcane details of where tax gets collected, I think that the $750 number is a very helpful talking point for Democrats. But if his final line on his tax return was $750 to the federal government at the end of the year, that doesn't take away from millions of dollars paid to state, local, and federal authorities, either through his companies or as an individual over the course of a year. And I also think this, Hillary Clinton pointed out in a debate 4 years ago that Donald Trump didn't pay income taxes. We know this. As Amber says, this is not something that's new. What Donald Trump will point at is the skyline in Manhattan and say, look, I contributed massively to developing this. You want to know what I've done to help increase the economy? I've built these buildings that put people to work. What has Joe Biden ever done? Those buildings are how I became a millionaire. How did Joe Biden become a millionaire? And I don't think that's a comfortable conversation for Democrats. So if I'm Democrats looking at the New York Times story, I say, great, 750, put it on the battle flag and let's move on. Because it's stylized.
There's no sense of equity in this at all, that if you're rich and you make lots of money, you should pay your fair share of taxes. Not penal taxes that would send you abroad or wherever, but just pay your fair share. There's no concern about that.
I think every American knows that our tax code is filled with carve-outs, especially carve-outs around real estate and construction, and that people expect it to be arcane, and they know that people pay taxes to lots of different entities through lots of different means. And so, in my view, it's highly unlikely that this is going to become an equity question, but more reinforce the sense in people's minds that we have a Byzantine tax code that rewards some behaviors and punishes others. If Donald Trump was a corporate executive who had a W-9 and was a rank and file employee, even a senior executive, and was only paying that much in income tax, it would be a much different issue. But as someone who owns his own businesses, and especially businesses heavy in real estate, it's much easier for him to make explanations to people. Look, you write off your mortgage interest deductions. I write off losses on my buildings. I take loans against assets. You people understand how this works, if not in the detail, then in the general sense.
That's what he's doing, of course. It's the banks that own his buildings, not him. Marcus, this is an example of American exceptionalism, isn't it? I mean, I can't think of any European democracy, ours included, in which a self-styled billionaire, who had refused to release his tax returns, but was then discovered that he'd paid $750 in tax. I mean, in any European democracy, would that not be a huge issue?
That would probably be a game changer in any European democracy.
It'd be a killer. for whoever was in that position, the campaign would be over.
Without question. Now, in the poll that followed the tax revelation, YouGov found that 58% of Americans believed the story to be completely or somewhat true, that 52% of Americans believed it was inappropriate for the president to have acted like this, but 35% of Americans believed that it was appropriate. What does that tell us? It tells us that partisanship is one hell of a drug. It tells us that the supporters for President Trump are prepared to find any way to justify the support, and the supporters of President Biden are prepared to always see the problem with President Trump. The question is whether or not this becomes, as Luke was saying at the start, something of a sharp dagger attack for the Democrats on President Trump on the wider issue of the economy. Because as we noted earlier, up until now, President Trump has enjoyed a small but solid lead in terms of being the preferred choice for economy handling over Vice President Biden. And if this becomes a kind of $750 soundbite that actually has resonance at an emotional level, then perhaps you see that number shift a little bit. There's no sign of that yet, but we're in early days, and we'll keep an eye on that in the polls.
Freddie, I'll give you the final word on this.
Well, I always think about a conversation I had in 2016 with a voter. I think it was in Cleveland, a guy who was going to vote for Trump. And I said in a sort of pompous British way, I said, you know, don't you think Donald Trump's a bit of a crook? And he said, oh, sure, but all the guys in Washington are 25-cent crooks, and Trump is the whole dollar crook. And he meant that enthusiastically. And I think that is American exceptionalism. They take a very different attitude to it. And the thing about Biden is, you know, the Hunter Biden and where he got his money from questions are real. And that's a sort of corruption that I think Americans hate, particularly because it's Washington corruption. Whereas Trump can say, you know, I got away, I tried to reduce my tax burden in the name of building big buildings.
This is the corruption of the property interests, which both Democrats and Republicans have been guilty because they've come up with tax codes which are hugely advantageous to property developers.
Yes, well, there's a very funny bit in the New York Times massively long report on it, where the sort of reporters seem to discover that it's because of an Obama change in the law in 2014 yes. that Trump was able to offset so much. And that's heartbreaking to them, but it's true. Both sides have connived to make.
No, both parties have responsibility for that, and there's no sign it's going to get any better. Mind you, the British tax code isn't that much better either. I think it's one of the longest in the world. We got 5 minutes. I want to come to Amy Coney Barrett, the nominee for the Supreme Court, devout Catholic, mother of 7. The hearings start, chaired by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who I see is maybe in a little bit of trouble in his own state. There, beginning on October the 12th. What I just want to find out from you all is that as these hearings get underway in the 3 weeks and a bit run up to the election, is this helpful to Mr. Trump to have this kind of battle, or is it unhelpful? Amber?
I think it's incredibly helpful if we use Kavanaugh in 2018 as a guide, because what happened then was the Democrats went way over their skis and attacked him for these insane and unproven sexual assault allegations. And unfortunately for Republicans, that happened a bit too far ahead of the midterms to have a real effect. But I talked to so many conservatives at that time that described themselves as being radicalized by what they saw as an evil that the Democrats were doing. If they go into the Amy Coney Barrett hearings with the same fervor and the same willingness to destroy her and her family at all costs, then that's going to have a huge blowback on the Democratic Party in general. So it's helpful to Trump insofar as it makes his party look better rather than him personally.
Luke, is this why we hear that some Democrats don't want to do a Kavanaugh this time, that although they don't want her to be the nominee, they may not push the votes out to try and stop it? Luke?
Well, there are conflicting interests among Democrats in the Senate. So as individuals, every Democratic senator on the Judiciary Committee wants to have a moment where they're asking hard questions and really, you know, taking a brickbat to Amy Coney Barrett because they can raise a ton of money that way. On the flip side, Amy Coney Barrett is a Midwestern white ethnic Catholic from Notre Dame. You cannot get a more quintessential figure. She's a suburban mother, relatively young. If Kamala Harris or Mazie Hirono or Dianne Feinstein are perceived in the hearings to be attacking Coney Barrett for her life choices, being a mother of 7, for her faith, being a devout Catholic, that will resonate in swing states like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Ohio, like Wisconsin, where you have large Catholic populations, a lot of whom cheer for Notre Dame.
Marcus, Mr. Biden last night in the debate, he said some nice things about Amy Coney Barrett. It made me wonder if I mean, he's very worried about Roe v. Wade, as are nearly all those opposed to her appointment. But I did begin to wonder if he really thought this was the fight that should be grabbing the headlines between the opening of the hearings on November the 3rd.
I think what Luke just said is very important about the Democratic Party needing to be very careful with its handling of this with regard to the huge importance of the Catholic vote in those battleground states. And I think that Joe Biden demonstrated his awareness of that in terms of his, as you put it, Andrew, somewhat surprising response to the question. I don't think there's an appetite at all on the part of the Biden campaign to make this the major issue in the home stretch of the election. They want to keep the focus on coronavirus. They want to keep the focus on the president's handling of that. In as much as there's a discussion of the Supreme Court, the Biden campaign and the Democrats know that they're on stronger ground when it's talking about defending the Affordable Care Act and ensuring the protection of pre-existing condition medical provisions within that. They don't want to get into a public fight over Roe versus Wade and a public fight over abortion. Not because of the national politics on abortion. After all, currently support for overturning Roe versus Wade only rests at about 25% in terms of the national picture, but rather because, as Luke was saying before, about the preponderance of Catholic voters in those crucial battleground states and a desire to keep the focus on something else, namely the coronavirus pandemic and the president's handling of that in the home stretch.
Freddie, final question to you. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, the fact he was a Catholic was quite a big issue, particularly in states like West Virginia. Indeed, his father had to buy West Virginia so that he could win it, because a big Presbyterian state. Now we're in a situation where there could soon be, I think you're a Catholic, Freddie, aren't you? There could soon be 6 Catholic Supreme Court justices. If you count Gorsuch, who was raised as a Catholic, you could say 7. Should the rest of us start to get worried? Are you going to bring back the Inquisition or something like that?
As a sinister left-footer, I can tell you this is all part of the plan. It's
going to plan, isn't it?
And the court is the right place where we can sit in judgment on everyone else. But I would say, actually, I'll just rush in a plug for the latest Spectator Monthly American edition, which has a fascinating piece about the role of religion in America, which of course ties into this. And it's interesting that while religion seems to have disappeared a little bit as a matter of public debate in politics, it now seems to manifest itself on the Supreme Court. And I think there's a lot of very interesting questions to be asked about that.
Okay, and that's a great cover story. We've got to go now. Thanks to all the guests tonight. It's great to talk to you. Thanks to you for tuning in to another episode of Spectator TV, USA Election Special. If you want to hear more from Spectator journalists of the kind that we've had on this program, subscribe to the Spectator's US edition. You'll get to read that great cover story. Go to, there he is, Freddie pushing it around. There it is. He's the editor, he's the salesman, marketing director, and actually you see him standing on the street corner selling it.
You'll go to heaven if you subscribe.
He's Catholic, he believes in heaven. Spectator.us is the website, /subscribe. You get a discount if you enter code TV. Do so. You won't regret it. It's really rather cheap as well. Or should I say, inexpensive. Thank you. See you next week. Bye-bye.